Hello and welcome to the next of our full course lectures. This lecture is the second of our lectures on ethical behaviour. So in this we're going to look, as I said in the previous lecture, at bribery and corruption in a little bit more detail. We're also then going to look at how you can go about making ethical decisions, and we're going to look in a bit of detail at a couple of models that we can use for making ethical decisions. We're then going to finish off with talking finally about ethical behaviour. So first things first, we're going to look at preventing corruption. We mentioned corruption in the previous lecture. We talked about bribery, we talked about fraud, those sorts of things. Well, there is some legislation in various different jurisdictions to try to prevent corruption and bribery. So in the US, we have the US Foreign and Corrupt Practices Act in 1977. Now this particularly looked at foreign officials, and we were trying in this to try and avoid bribery of foreign officials. So the US Foreign and Corrupt Practices Act was focusing mainly on that. There then was the UN Convention Against Corruption in 2003. So this sought to bring in some legislation that gave us some principles to prevent corruption. But the main piece of legislation I want to look at here is the UK Bribery Act 2010. Now, this has been called the most draconian piece of legislation in world law. So the UK Bribery Act is really something that clamps down on bribery. So what it was really is a modernisation of the law. It's going to apply to all UK businesses, and it's going to apply to all businesses operating in the UK. So it sought to modernise the bribery laws to try and see if they could combat bribery and corruption. So what did they say in this piece of legislation that bribes actually were? Well, bribes are when there is payments for a criminal and they're going to be paid, or they're going to receive, or indeed if you don't prevent payments to criminals or criminal payments. So it's going to be criminal to pay a bribe, it's going to be criminal to receive a bribe, and it's going to be criminal not to prevent a bribe being paid. Now, as you can imagine, that gives us quite a bit of a problem, because how do we know that we could have prevented a bribe being paid or not? And in fact, the business itself will be liable, even if they were unaware that the bribe was being paid. And there will be large fines for the business if this occurs. So if someone within the business, perhaps a rogue employee, pays a bribe, receives a bribe, or indeed doesn't prevent a bribe being paid, the business itself will be liable for that, even if they were unaware that it was taking place at the time. And there are very large fines if that happens. So that's why it's been called a very draconian piece of legislation. Now, how can a business defend themselves against these charges? Well, the defence will be that they had adequate procedures in place to prevent bribery. So you can see, therefore, that it is absolutely crucial that UK businesses and businesses operating in the UK, therefore, have those adequate procedures to prevent bribery. So how do we decide whether the procedures are adequate? So we have some procedures in place, and we'll look in a second at what the procedures would be. But what would be enough to prevent us being liable under this law? Well, proportionality is the first thing that the court will look at, i.e., are the procedures that we have in place in proportion to the risk of bribes being paid? So there needs to be proportionality. The procedures we have in place must be in proportion to the risk of bribery. There needs to be a top level commitment. So as with a lot of these different areas we've looked at, it's going to feed down from the top of the organisation. And there must be a top level commitment to try to reduce the risk of bribes being paid, or indeed any bribes being received by anyone in the firm. There must be a risk assessment. Okay, that risk assessment must take into account various different factors that will affect the risk of bribery. First of all, the country in which you're operating. Well, of course, some countries will have bribery as a matter of course. It's just part of the culture. So if that's the case, well then that's a big risk if you're operating in that culture. Also, the sector, the industry sector that you're operating in will also play a part in how risky it is, how much risk there is of bribes being paid or received. Also, the value of the business that you're involved in. So if there is a lot of money involved, well then that makes it higher risk because it makes it worth someone's while to actually take a bribe or pay a bribe. The business type again, so some types of business will be more open to bribery, cash-based businesses for example. And of course the people that you're dealing with. So are the people trustworthy? Do the people that you're dealing with have integrity? All of those will form part of the risk assessment that the business must undertake. And that risk assessment must be thorough and must consider all of those different areas in order that the procedures be enough to cover you for this bribery act. There also has to be communication to staff of the requirements under the Bribery Act and of the controls that should be in place to try to prevent bribes being taken or received. And we need to do due diligence on all clients and all people that we deal with. Lastly, the procedures should be monitored and should be reviewed regularly to ensure that they're acting appropriately. So if there happens to be a bribe paid or received, well then the court will look to see whether your procedures are enough based on these different areas. Are the procedures proportional? Do we have top level commitment? Has there been a risk assessment carried out looking at all of those different areas? Are staff aware of it? Has there been due diligence on clients and customers? And do we have a monitoring and review process? So that's to tell us whether the procedures are enough. What procedures may you actually have within the organisation to try to prevent bribes being paid or received? Well, there must be reporting mechanisms. So whistleblowing effectively must be in place so that if there is some suspicion, that can be reported in the organisation. There'll also be screening of employees and associates, so trying to see if they're trustworthy, trying to see if they've been involved in anything like this before, screening to try and risk assess both employees and associates of the firm. We must have an internal audit firm within the firm, and that internal audit function will therefore check whether the procedures are enough and whether we're controlling our risk of being part of a bribery or a corruption. Also, we could have checks over our prices and our discounts. So we need to have controls to make sure our prices are correct, our discounts are correct, and the discounts aren't being offered in way of a bribe. Also, if there is a bidding process, for example, for IT contracts, well then that bidding process needs to be transparent. There needs to be rules and they need to be applied to all. And lastly, approval of all decisions. So once decisions are made, they need to be approved by high management decisions because we need to make sure that we haven't got employees within the organisation maybe taking a bribe to make that decision. So therefore, we need to have high level approval of those decisions to ensure that that hasn't taken place. So those are some of the procedures that should be in place to try to prevent bribery. We also know then how to assess whether those procedures are enough, and therefore that will ensure that we have a defence if a bribe was to actually happen. And of course, it makes bribery less of a risk because we have the procedures in place. However, we do need to be aware that there are barriers to putting these procedures in place. They start with the time and the cost involved. So it's going to take time to put these procedures in place. For example, establishing an internal audit function, having a transparent bidding process, and that will cost money. So that's always going to be a barrier to putting those procedures in. It may also dilute our competitive advantage because we simply have so many controls. Those controls reduce the flexible nature of our competitive advantage. We may also find that we have management apathy, i.e. that management simply aren't bothered about putting these procedures in place, and therefore the procedures simply aren't carried out. Also, using off-the-shelf procedures. One of the key things about this Bribery Act is it says that the procedures that you put in place must be specific to your firm. Remember we talked about that risk assessment where we look at the country we're operating in, the sector, the value of the business type and the people? Well, if we assess all of that, it's unlikely that we're going to have the same procedures in place that another business has. So using off-the-shelf procedures simply isn't going to be enough. The procedures that we put in place must be specific to the risks that our firm is facing, and therefore will be seeking to reduce that risk. Also, red tape will be a problem going through bureaucracy, so getting all of this established. Pressure and targets, so simply pressure to get the bidding process done, pressure to get sales done, may well mean that some of the procedures aren't carried out. Maybe the bidding process wouldn't be as transparent as it should be. Maybe we're selling to people that ordinarily we wouldn't, but we've got pressure to meet sales targets. Or indeed simply a flawed culture in the organisation. If the culture isn't interested in putting these procedures in place, or we do have a flawed culture where people are willing to give bribes or take bribes, well then that's going to be a barrier to putting these procedures in place. But the business would have to realise that they open themselves up to large fines if indeed they fall foul of this new UK Bribery Act. So that's a little bit on preventing corruption, specifically looking at this new UK Bribery Act. This is new, something that may well come up in the exam, so make sure that you know all of those areas. So the next thing I want to move on to have a look at is making ethical decisions. So this is core to what the accountant is actually going to have to do when it comes to specific ethical or moral decisions. So the first thing that the accountant will need to do is to be educated about what they should be doing. So we have the AAASB Ethics Education Framework. So this really is a stage process. So it goes through 4 stages, and it really looks at how accountants through their career will try to apply ethics. So it looks at a 4-stage process, and it says, look, throughout your career, you start at the start of these stages, stage 1, and throughout your career, you'll move forward with your ethical education and therefore make better ethical decisions. So the 4 stages identified throughout an accountant's career where you'll become aware of ethics are, first of all, ethical knowledge. So this is right at the start of your career. At that stage, like now, you'll be learning about the theories. So you'll be gaining that ethical knowledge through your exams and through the induction process into the professional career that you're going to have. So we understand the theories at this stage. We're simply becoming aware of them. Moving on then, when you become a little bit more experienced, you get what's called ethical sensitivity. So that means that you start to apply the principles that you've learnt. So you apply those principles and you learn further from doing that. So you start to say, oh right, okay, so that's how we applied it that time. So we need to do the same the next time. Once you've learnt and done that throughout your career, well then you'll be able to make ethical judgments. So that means you'll be able to make reasoned decisions based on the scenarios that you have in your working life. So making those judgments will mean that you have to take decisions, will mean that you'll have to weigh up different pros and different cons to actually reason through what the correct decision is. Finally, that will lead to ethical behaviour. So by having lifelong education, CPD, on your ethical requirements and your ethical principles, your behaviour will be more ethical. You'll be able to make the judgments that are required by the professional accountant. So you have that 4-stage process throughout your career. You'll have ethical knowledge at the start where you understand the theories, moving into ethical sensitivity where you're able to apply the principles but still continue learning. You then are able to make ethical judgments where you make a reasoned decision based on ethical principles, and that leads to lifelong ethical behaviour where you continue to learn but you're able to make ethical judgments. So there are some models for us to use to resolve ethical issues. And I want to look at each of these in turn. The first model that we need to be aware of is the AAA model. And what this is the American Accounting Association model. So what this does is it asks 7 questions for making ethical decisions. So you can take any ethical decision that you need to make and ask these 7 questions. And that will lead you to the decision that is correct. So for the purposes of the exam, you may well get a scenario. And in that scenario, you will have to ask these 7 questions. Use the information from the scenario to answer the 7 questions, and that will lead you to the ethical decision at the end. So the 7 questions we need to ask are, first of all, what are the facts of the case? So for the purposes of the exam, that will be looking at the scenario in detail and actually getting to the bottom of what the facts are. So being very careful to not take opinion into account, but just looking at what the facts are as they happened. We then need to ask, what are the ethical issues? Are there, for example, ethical threats? Are there breaches of the ethical principles? What are the ethical issues? Or is it maybe a public interest situation? So once you've identified what the facts of the case are and what the ethical issues are, you can then establish what the norms, principles, or values you should be applying are. So should you be applying the 5 ethical principles from the ACCA code? Is it in the public interest that you do something? What should you be doing in this situation? The next question to ask is, what are the alternative courses of action? So as with any situation, there will be alternative courses, not just one thing you could do. So depending on those alternative courses, you will have to try to identify what the best course of action. So select through your alternative courses which is the best course of action. You then need to establish what the consequences are likely to be of taking that action to ensure that it is the best course of action. And that finally will lead you to the decision that you need to make. So you need to learn those 7 questions. This comes up in the exam fairly regularly. So learn the 7 questions and make sure that you're able to apply them to an ethical situation. And we're going to look at a scenario in illustration 1 shortly, which will use these 7 questions, so we'll get an idea of how to use them. Another model for resolving ethical issues is Trucker's model. So Trucker says we need to ask 5 questions to decide whether a decision is ethical. And those 5 questions are, is the decision, first of all, profitable? Is the decision legal? Is the decision fair? Is the decision right? And is the decision sustainable? Now, if we can answer those 5 questions in the positive, well then the decision that we're making is likely to be the right one. So again, Truckers is a model where you simply have to use the 5 headings, look at the scenario that you're given and answer the 5 questions. Is it profitable? Is it legal? Is it fair? Is it right? Is it sustainable? If it is, well then that is probably the correct decision from an ethical point of view. So really we could break down our ethical decisions into these 2 models in any given situation. We're going to look here at the AAA model in illustration 1. Now this is a much longer scenario than you're used to, so it's introducing you to the sort of thing you can expect in your question 1 in the exam. So it's a long scenario. So read through it, get an idea of the decisions. That means that the answer is going to be a little bit longer than usual as well. So if you want to have a go at it, make sure that you go into it in full and in detail, and then work through the answer with me to learn from it. The requirement in illustration 1 is to use the 7-step American Accounting Association model for ethical decision making and examine the company's dilemma on whether or not to disclose this information publicly. So make sure you've read through this scenario. It's a long scenario. It's an example of a question 1. So we're getting an idea of how long the information and the scenario we're given is going to be. So we need to be able to deal with all of that information. The requirement's also a bit longer, so we're looking at 14 marks here, so we're going to have to say a bit more than usual. So at least we have a 7-step program for how we're going to actually deal with this situation. So you need to make sure that you know the 7 steps and then apply them in the scenario. So step 1 is to say, what are the facts of the case? Well, here we have the Mary Jane, one of the company's ships, and it is sunk, and one of the contributory causes of the disaster was that the ship had not received the necessary modifications for operating in the rougher seas between Eastport and Northport. So we have a ship here, it has sunk with the loss of life, and it looks like Some of it was down to the company because they didn't do these necessary modifications and they knew they should have done that. So the next step is to say, what are the ethical issues in the case? So here the ethical issues are whether to disclose the information publicly, i.e. that they knew they should have made these modifications and hadn't, thereby providing bereaved families with a better explanation of why their loved ones died. And of course, they could then get more damages based on that. Or they could conceal the information, thereby limiting the value of any punitive damages and protecting shareholder value. So those are really the ethical issues. We need to then ask, what are the norms, principles and values relevant to this case? So we can see here that the company is bound by the norms and expectations of its stock exchange. It also has voluntarily claimed to have the highest standards of corporate ethics, particularly valuing its reputation for outstanding customer care. So those are things that it says it has. Now, we would have to say that this means that it owes an implicit and explicit duty of care to both its consumers, its customers, and its shareholders. As a company that seemingly values its reputation as a well-governed organisation, it's also bound by the underlying principles of corporate governance, and that includes integrity, probity, and transparency, all of those we've talked about on this course. So it's going to be bound by those, and it needs to take account of that fact. Step 4 then is to ask, what are the alternative courses of action here? So alternative 1 is to disclose the information about the advice on the structural work to the Mary Jane. So we'd expose that information to the media, the government, the bereaved families. Or we could suppress the information within the company and hope that there was no leak. So don't let the information out of the company. Well, now in step 5, we need to ask what course of action is most consistent with the norms, values and principles. So those are the values and principles that we identified in step 3. So which course of action fits in with those? Well, we can see here that that information is material to a number of parties' better understanding of why the Mary Jane sank. The bereaved families, maritime accident investigators, the government, insurers, shipping companies, they would all benefit from having the information so that they can all be aware and make sure that it doesn't happen again. So disclosure would seem to be the most appropriate course of action, and notwithstanding the potentially unfortunate consequences for Sea Ships Company of this information leaking out. Step 6 then is, what is the consequences of each possible course of action? If the company makes a disclosure, there's a risk that the punitive damages would be higher, so we need to recognise that fact initially. A large enough fine is going to damage the cash flows of the company, and disclosure would potentially invalidate any insurance policy, and that would further harm shareholder value, potentially even sink the company. So if the company were to suppress the information, then each person in possession of the knowledge would not only have to examine their own responsibilities in the matter, but the consultant who recommended the upgrade would also be a potential risk. If they left the company, they may well leak the information. So they'll need to think about that as a company and as individuals. Finally, step 7 is to say, what is the decision on the basis of all those other steps? Well, alternative 1 is that the company could make a full and detailed disclosure, probably with an acceptance of full responsibility for the failure, and to make the necessary amendments to the ship. This would be a very costly choice, but would be consistent with the company's claimed ethical values. So it did say it had those ethical values, and also with the important core values of corporate governance in general. Alternative 2 is to suppress the information and take all necessary measures to ensure that it's not revealed. That would be a very risky option, as the cost of the company and the directors personally, if it were to emerge, would be very, very serious. So it would be against the letter and spirit of the core values of corporate governance and unlikely to protect shareholder value in the long term, and is therefore the least ethical of the options. We should therefore avoid alternative 2. So really, alternative 1 should be our decision. We should disclose fully what has happened so that the consequences can be taken up. So that's how we use the American accounting model. Take yourself through each of those steps, but of course that means that you need to learn those steps so that in the exam, if this comes up, you can go through them one by one. So now that we've used the American Accounting Association model and we understand how to go about that, also we've looked at Tucker's model, we could broadly speaking say that there are 4 stages here when it comes to making moral decisions or engaging in moral behaviour. So first things first, we need to recognise the moral issue. So that's what both models get us to do. We then need to make a moral judgment. Now, it doesn't really matter how we go about doing that, so long as we do it. We need to establish the moral intent and then engage in the moral behaviour. So those are the stages in making a moral decision. Recognise the issue, make a moral judgment, establish the intent, and then engage in that moral behaviour. So lastly, I just want to consider when making an ethical decision, when you're more likely to have ethical behaviour. There's 2 little areas to this. The first of it is the nature of the issue and considering the nature of the issue. Well, first of all, you need to consider the moral intensity. So are we going to engage in ethical behaviour? Well, if there's high moral intensity, well then it's more likely that an ethical decision will be made. And moral intensity just refers to how much view there is on that subject, how many views and how much detail it's thought about. So the moral intensity thinks about how intense the moral decision actually is. High intensity, then an ethical decision is likely. When it comes to the nature of the issue also, we need to think about the moral framing. So this is how widely the issue is discussed and thought about in a social context. So if it's discussed widely, well again then it's more likely that an ethical decision will be made. So the more widely the issue is discussed, the more likely an ethical decision will be made. So when we're considering ethical behaviour, we need to think about the nature of the issue. First of all, the moral intensity involved, then the moral framing. And then we need to think about the context of the issue. And some things will make moral behaviour and ethical behaviour more likely. For example, establishing a reward system that rewards ethical behaviour. That will make the decision more likely to be ethical. Also setting clear roles and responsibilities, especially when it comes to, for example, internal controls that seek to implement some sort of ethical behaviour. The culture is all important when it comes to this, so considering the culture within the entity will make sure that if that culture engages in ethical behaviour as a general rule, that is the norm, well then that's more likely that there will be ethical behaviour on an ongoing basis. Also, authorities and discipline. So are there procedures to ensure that ethical behaviour is undertaken? And bureaucracy. Again, more controls will lead to more ethical decisions being made. So when we're considering ethical behaviour, we'll think about both the nature of the issue and the context of the issue to try to ensure that an ethical decision is come to. So that was our lecture on ethical behaviour, the second of our 2 lectures looking at this area. Make sure that you're aware of the UK Bribery Act and the requirements for procedures that are adequate. And make sure that you can consider ethical decisions using both Tucker's model and the AAA model.